All right. Good evening, everybody. Hope you are as excited as I am to take a journey on our Desert Wildlife of Namibia safari this evening. My name is Andrew Beck. For those of you who haven't met me or joined me on safari as yet, thank you very much for joining me for this evening. I hope that you are excited. For those who haven't joined us on a webinar before, you'll see that you have a Q&A section down at the bottom. And then there's also a rolling chat function. So if you want to just jump on that chat, let me know who's here, where you are in the world, where you're joining us from. I see Silka's there, Nicholas, Val Sparks saying hi. Just going to let the numbers climb a little bit. But essentially what we're going to be doing this evening is I'm going to be taking you on a bit of a journey through our Desert Wildlife of Namibia itinerary. It's an itinerary which is slightly different from the usual trips that go through Namibia, and there's a reason for that. And I really just wanted to just kind of share a little bit about the experience that guests who join us on this trip get, and the places that they get to visit, because for a lot of people who may have done a self-drive trip through Namibia, they would never have got to some of the places that I'm going to share with you this evening. So just as a reminder, I probably won't be seeing the chat as we go through this evening. I'm going to be focusing on my presentation, but there is the dedicated Q&A section. You should find that on your panel there. So please, any questions that you have, load those in there. And as we get to the end of the presentation, I will jump onto those and answer those for you. I'm just going to go ahead here, get my remote started and get my presentation going. Let's give it a second here. All right, I'm going to share that with you guys and we should be good to go. Why is this popping up here? Sorry, just a little bit of a technical issue here. Just want to get this out of the way. What is this doing? There we go. That should do the trick. And right, let's go back one slide, shall we? So, the Desert Wildlife of Namibia. Believe it or not, this image is actually taken in Namibia. It looks like a bit of a lunar landscape, and I thought that would be a fitting opening slide because Namibia really is quite a different country to so many other places in Southern Africa, and I think that's what part of its appeal is for so many people. From a map perspective, just to give you an idea of where we're going to be going this evening, obviously the capital of Namibia over here, Windhoek, and Sossusvlei down in the south here, Etosha, very well-known areas up in the north here. You can see the massive pan from the satellite map. We are going on a journey that's going to kind of take us through this kind of northwestern corner of Namibia, all the way along to the Skeleton Coast and even onto the Skeleton Coast itself here at a place called Movabai. So that's just to give you an idea of where in the greater scheme of things. And if we zoom in a little bit closer onto those key destinations, you'll see this is the first area that we're going to be visiting, the first camp here, Doro Nawas, then Damaraland camp, very close to one another, but chosen for very different reasons. And then moving to Desert Rhino camp up in the Palmbach concession, and then to a very, very special part of Namibia in the Hoanib Skeleton Coast camp up in the northwestern corner. So something that I get asked quite a bit on this is why not include Sossusvlei? Well, it's fairly simple. Sossusvlei all the way down in the south, and for a lot of people who maybe have been to Namibia but haven't been to these destinations, may not want to go back there, it's a very easy destination to extend and add on to this itinerary. So we offer that as an extension, and for example, for next year's trip, which was due to take place this year, we have a private guided extension where guests who join us next year can also opt to arrive a couple of days earlier and extend to include Sossusvlei. And that's one of the reasons that we didn't include it in the scheduled itinerary. And then why not include Etosha? And that is a very good question, because initially when we designed this itinerary, we did have a private reserve just south of Etosha where we could go into the national park as well, included in the itinerary. And from a logistics perspective, we'd move up to the north and then finish at Etosha. And Jono and I, when we did the recce for this trip, because we like to get first-hand experience, we just felt that that wasn't really going to work. And, you know, I joined Jono at a Desert Rhino camp. Jono came from Hoanib to Desert Rhino camp. And then we flew together into a reserve just south of Etosha. And the only way that I can describe it is as if you'd kind of been in this euphoric state, and then all of a sudden someone just pours a bucket of ice cold water over you, because you'd come from the middle of nowhere where there were no other guests, it wasn't commercial, onto a farm where there was a lot of mopani, which all of a sudden becomes familiar. It's not the different landscape that we were experiencing. You're having to queue to get into the national park, dealing with self-drive vehicles, sitting around water holes with other vehicles coming around and parking. And it didn't quite fit with the kind of experience that we were wanting to give our guests, or the experience that we'd had coming from these more isolated areas. So moving across the Namibian landscape is obviously, you know, they're very good road networks, but it's long drives. And for the groups of our guests, we prefer to take the fly option. So the journey begins in Windhoek, and then we fly north to Doro Nawas. And the flights alone through this country are just spectacular. The terrain is changing all the time. It's a geological fun fest. I had a lady who joined us last year who was, she's a PhD geologist, and she just couldn't get enough. And it was fascinating listening to her talking about the different rock forms and the landscape structures. So even from an aeroplane, I mean, this is nothing fancy. It's not doors off helicopter flights or anything like that. This is just flying between camps and destinations. This particular flight flying north from Windhoek up towards Doro Nawas is incredible. And the further north we go, the more you start to see the terrain change, and you start to get those dunes and the sands coming through, and eventually landing at Doro Nawas airstrip and Doro Nawas camp. Now, as you can see here, these beds are outside on the deck and of the lodge itself. And that's one of the great features about this camp, is that the beds are actually on wheels. So you can decide in the evening just to wheel your bed out and park off underneath the crystal clear skies, underneath a blanket of stars. It's fantastic for astrophotography. You just kind of lean out the side of your bed and set off the remote shutter. But all jokes aside, Doro Nawas camp, the first camp that we start at, it's a fairly large camp with 16 units. Built up on top of a hill with the rooms then down at the bottom. So the views from up top are just spectacular, but a great place to start. Very comfortable rooms, and all of the camps that we use in this itinerary are part of the Wilderness Safaris collection. So you guys will know the kind of standards of service and accommodation that you can get out there. But the fact that these beds are on wheels, I just thought was really, really cool. And it certainly does make quite a big difference when you're wanting to get out and do a bit of astrophotography, and also from an experience perspective. This camp is ideally located to get into some of the geological features and the petroglyphs that are around there. Now, petroglyphs are actually rock engravings, and the famous site of Twyfelfontein is actually very, very close to the camp. So it's a great way to start the journey, a little bit more of the history of the area, the culture. This Twyfelfontein section was proclaimed a national monument back in 1952, and it's one of the most famous rock art concentrations in Africa, featuring more than 5,000 petroglyphs and rock paintings. So very unique in the form that it's actually more really rock engravings than the actual paintings. And they've got a fantastic museum as you walk through. We have a private guide that will take us through this. They're explaining the different sections to us, the history of the area, and then also just accompanying us through the different sections and art forms that we can see here. So we spend a good 2 hours walking through here with our local guide. And just want to kind of point out on these rocks here, you can see here's a giraffe, for example, some antelope species over here, and you can see all the way up onto this rock over here. This is actually a lion. You can see the tail going up. And I'm going to explain a little bit more on how these rock art forms came to be. But it's just incredible to spend a bit of time walking around here and seeing what these people are seeing or have seen all these years ago in the middle of the desert. You have a look down here, you've got an elephant. This is obviously a flamingo, and I say obviously, I use that fairly loosely, but incredible to see. And they're the most well-preserved gravings that you can imagine. A lot of ostrich, a lot of giraffe, a lot of elephant, stars, and human figures as well, as you kind of make your way through this. One of the interesting ones that I picked up on this one, I don't know if you can see it here on the right-hand side, but this seal, it's got its head poking through here. This is obviously a rhino as well. And wildebeest over here, more giraffe, lots of giraffe in fact. And it's just amazing to see how these rock engravings have weathered so well over the years. So the site was first inhabited for about 6,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers, and then both the ethnic groups used these areas as rituals. So they would have sites to conduct these rituals, and it's shamanistic rituals which during that time when these guys were smoking whatever they were or getting into that kind of transcendent state, that they would then come up with these rock engravings. And it's just incredible to see them out here. And the area was then uninhabited for a long period until just after the Second World War, when there was a severe drought. And the core of this section is actually centered around a spring, a natural spring that comes out to the side of the rock face here, just up and to the left of where this photograph was taken. And it was during that period that the Afrikaans or Boer farmers then moved into this region. This is just one part of this section. These are the organ pipes, which are also quite well known, and a very interesting rock formation there, where these groups of columnar basalts, which resemble organ pipes, have actually pushed through into a liquid lava and then kind of solidified in this hexagonal kind of state. And they look like organ pipes. And just to give you an idea of the sense of scale here, it's absolutely fascinating. So really nice, take a bit of time to walk through here. This is all on our first full morning activity. We also then head across to the petrified forest. Now what you're seeing here is an ancient pine tree that's probably washed down from Central Africa millions of years ago. This particular tree is about 45 meters in length. And what's happened is it was covered by a whole bunch of alluvial sands and deposits which sat on top of it. And then through a process of silification, they basically were fossilized, and it's kept its color and the bark and the texture. You can see it there. And it's really just incredible to see. There are a couple of these really long, fairly intact trees that have been washed down and then deposited in this area, but lots of actual petrified wood and broken away sections of this in these surrounding areas of the sandstone that's been eroded away over time. So that's the first little section around Doro Nawas. It really is just a diving board and a stepping stone into the journey. There are game drives that we take and walks, and we also get down to the Hoanib River, where there's a good chance of seeing the desert adapted elephants. And obviously in Namibia, wherever there's low-lying areas and river systems with beautiful trees, there's going to be good wildlife as well. From here, we hop just a little bit further north to Damaraland camp, which is spectacular for astrophotography. It is well isolated. It's in one of the best wilderness areas in Namibia, just overlooking the Hoanib River Valley. And it really is a spectacular camp in its own right. You can see this is maybe a little bit notch up above Doro Nawas, where you get a lot of self-drives and people just popping in for a one-night stay before moving on. This is a little bit more intimate, a little bit smaller, and you can see that the units themselves are a little bit more ornate. It's an absolutely stunning section and is run in conjunction with the Torah conservancies. So guests are able to go through to visit the nearby farmsteads and to see how the relationship between the local communities and wilderness safaris works. Now, community conservation is a massive success story in Namibia. It has had its challenges and probably still does to this day, but overall it's a really great and successful collaboration between the local communities and ecotourism, which I think is going to become an even greater and more important combination of people working together for the sustainability and the future of the area. Now, I could not believe that this is in the middle of the Namib Desert. This is down in the Hoanib River Valley. This was one afternoon when we were out looking for desert adapted elephants that were moving along the riverbed. And I just couldn't believe this site is a real oasis in the middle of nowhere. And it just goes to kind of speak to the diversity of the region. And from a photographic perspective, something that guests need to realize with Namibia is that you're not going to have the concentration of game that you would get in the Delta, in the Lowveld, or in East Africa, but there are going to be so many different and unique photographic opportunities. I mean, these backlit grasses on these short gravel plains, all you need is something like a little jackal to pop into them and you've got an incredible photographic opportunity. And so something that I enjoy about this itinerary is that it's quite a slow pace. We take our time to appreciate certain things and to look at the finer details. Things like a welwitschia plant. Now, trick question, how many leaves does a welwitschia plant have? Well, this plant, which is actually endemic to Namibia and to Angola, actually only has 2 leaves. Now, these leaves grow out initially, and then through the process of weathering, they get split and torn, and they can be up to 4 meters long, but they've all just been split away and broken away from this. And in terms of age, some of these plants, it's very difficult to actually get an accurate age on them, but they reckon that some of these plants can be anywhere between 1,000 and possibly even up to 2,000 years old. So really an incredible piece of history that has really weathered some of the most incredible climate that you can imagine through this area. This is a typical scene around the Damaraland section, just looking through these rolling plains. And I absolutely love how you get the change in the colors of the soil and the rock as you look across these plains. And, you know, stopping to take photographs like this, generally on a normal safari, you wouldn't have much in the way of scenery like this that you would want to stop for. But in Namibia, this is the norm, is to get out and spend a bit of time photographing a particular tree, setting it in a space with the nice clouds, or just appreciating the scene. And I really enjoy doing that. And then once you start to throw some wildlife into the mix, and there are animals scattered around, but just not in any large numbers, it changes the game. And those of you who've traveled with me will know that I'm a huge fan of animals in their environment. So something like this, just a small oryx in this massive desert landscape, really does tell a story, and it's a photographer's dream. The same with the mountain zebra here. It's just a completely different environment. And as you go along this journey through Namibia, you can't help but ask yourself the question of, you know, how on earth do animals survive in this desolate space? And the riverbeds are a massive part of that. And so some of the trees that are down there, this is an acacia tree, they are the lifeblood of the region. And again, you know, being able to stop and just spend a bit of time, 20 minutes walking around this incredibly detailed, gnarly tree in the middle of nowhere is the sort of thing that you'd kind of drive past normally on other safaris and say, oh, look at that tree, isn't that beautiful? And then you kind of move on. But on this trip, the pace is of such a nature that you're able to actually stop, get out and appreciate and photograph these sort of things. I will never forget this afternoon in the Hoanib River Valley. This was my first sighting of the desert adapted elephants. And as you can see, one of the adaptations that they have are these slightly enlarged feet. And it was very noticeable that, as well as the kind of the toes, they almost looked like a turtle, like a ninja turtle was the word, the kind of thing, that immediate picture that came to my mind. But you can see those feet and those toes have just got so much character. And they've obviously been well worn and trodden as these animals move across this landscape. And one of the other adaptations that they have is they move in smaller herds out here, and they are less water dependent. So they'll move long distances in the evenings, foraging along these river valleys during the day, and then they can go for up to 2 to 3 days without actually drinking any water. And it's incredible to see these animals, an animal of this size, out in an area where food is actually at such a premium. And then, of course, sunsets in Namibia, in the Damaraland region, particularly with these flat open grass plains or gravel plains in front of you, the skies are spectacular. And that's why I like to go a little bit earlier in the season, not really at the height of the dry season, because the skies become very neutral and flat then. And being able to kind of see this sunset on the scale whilst you're out there and have some clouds in the sky really does make for a fantastic experience. Speaking of the sky, the Tomorrowland camp, again, really nice to, whilst there's not a lot of wildlife around there, almost every night you have an opportunity to photograph the night sky. This is obviously just a Milky Way shot. Very simple kind of recipe to get these kind of images. Set your camera up on a tripod, have a 2-second timer delay, switch it into full manual. ISO, I would say at around about 2,500. You run this at about 20 seconds. And you'll be amazed, and then obviously manually focusing to infinity. You will be amazed at what the camera can see in that night sky. So we spent 2 nights at Damaraland camp exploring that area. There's always the potential for things like desert adapted lions, the desert rhinos, elephants, and all the general game around there. You never know where these animals are going to pop up. But one thing is for sure, that when you move to desert rhino camp, where we spend 3 nights, the focus is firmly on desert rhino. So this camp is in the Palmbach concession, and it's home to one of the largest free roaming populations of the rare and endangered black rhino. And the focus here is on actually tracking these black rhino, getting out on foot with the Save the Rhino Trust rangers who monitor these animals in this population on a daily basis, taking down some of those details, and then obviously logging that for their records. So again, it's another great way where you've got the local community who are partnered with the camp, as well as conservation initiatives like the Save the Rhino Trust, where conservation is being funded by guests going into the field and contributing. And it's almost like a citizen science type project in a sense, where you're going out and monitoring these animals with the guys from the Save the Rhino Trust. So this camp, also fairly small, 8 tents scattered around the main area, beautiful views out into the open, surrounded by welwitschers, and it really is a fantastic little camp where we spend these 3 nights. And so we'll kind of land here in the afternoon. There's a lot of general game around, things like springbok and oryx, giraffe, and they do often see lions. And on our first evening, we just like to take it easy, just kind of get a lay of the land and enjoy a sundowner. I know a couple of you are looking at that gin and tonic on the table there quite longingly, as am I. So yeah, we kind of sit around, have a sundowner. Our local guide will explain to us the kind of run of the day whilst we're out here. And it can be a very, very long day out in the field with these guys. The landscape here is very barren. This is an aerial shot of Euphorbia damarana, which is one of the kind of succulent plants in the area that the black rhino really like to feed on during the dry season. And it's actually a toxic plant, but the black rhino in the region have adapted to feed off of this, and they can actually extract some nutritive value out of it as well. There's a lot of welwitschia plants around, and again, you know, you have the time to get out and kind of stop and have a look at these and photograph some of the other wildlife that occur in the area. And my mind is blown away every time I see animals out here. You just kind of think, well, you know, what on earth is a giraffe going to be feeding on in a space like this? And the moment that you see your first black rhino is just absolutely incredible, because you think, how on earth do these animals survive here? And they were almost kind of poached to extinction during the late 1970s and early 80s in the illegal trade of rhino horn and ivory at the same time. But seeing these animals now in this kind of environment, it really is incredible to see the work that has been done by the Save the Rhino Trust team. And a typical day out on a rhino tracking mission, you go out with the Save the Rhino Trust vehicles. They head out in front of you, and these guys will head off and they check every single spring. So these rhinos start to move around in the early hours of the evening. They're most active during the evening. Obviously, it's nice and cool at that time, and drink just before dawn. So the first place to go and check for fresh rhino spoor is at the springs. And these Rhino Trust guys know this area like the back of their hand. The section is broken up into a number of zones, and they never, ever monitor or move into the same zone twice in consecutive days. So for example, if you start off in zone 4 today, the next day they'll move into zone 3. That zone gets a day to rest. And this is something that is very interesting. Is I know people who've been into the Palmbach main area for where the local tourists, you know, the self-dive tourists can go through. And you really struggle to find these animals. And I'll tell you how long it took Jono and I before we found our first rhino on our mission there. But the way that these guys are managing this private concession is they've got prime habitat. The rhinos are very sensitive to disturbance, things like vehicles and camps. So the camp has been situated in an area which is not in the core of their range. And they then rotate through these different zones to make sure that there's not a regular vehicle presence in there, which could actually push these animals away from that zone. So they're very, very respectful in the way that it's done. Zone 4 is one of the biggest zones, if I remember correctly, but I've had it twice when we go there, and I absolutely love it because it takes forever to find a rhino, which means that you get to spend more time out in the field exploring and seeing and appreciating this Martian landscape. And just when you think that you're never going to see these bloody rhino in the middle of nowhere, these guys will find it. And it's happened to me twice. On Jono and my occasion, I think At about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we eventually found our first rhinos. And after that, we spotted another 3. And the same with our group when we were there last year. I think we waited until after lunchtime. We all stopped and enjoyed lunch under the shade of a tree. And then eventually, a little later that day, we found our first rhino. And I think we got another 5 rhino in total after that. So an incredible experience. You are going to find them. When these guys pick them up with binoculars, you will not believe. They will point out there and you would think that it's just a rock or a bush. But sure as nuts, it would be a rhino. And then, so what happens is the guys will drive over this rocky terrain to get to a place where it's fairly close by, and then we can walk down and approach the rhinos. And that's when these guys will start to monitor. So you've got the Save the Rhino Trust guys with you who are then logging GPS coordinates. They would know which individuals these are. So they're looking at things like the ear notches. These are known individuals within a population. They take down their condition, their associations, who they're hanging around with. Is there a male around? Is there another female around? What are the details? They log them in their books, and they talk to you about this as they're doing it. And you have an incredible encounter, but always with the rhino's safety being the main priority. So if you've never seen a black rhino and you would like to say that the first one that you saw, you were on foot with it, this is an experience that I can highly recommend. And it's the reason that we chose to do 3 nights here, because the 3 nights will give you 2 days or 2 mornings to actually go and track the black rhino. On your last morning, if you're departing, there's not enough time to go out on an activity and then still get back to make your flight out. So 3 nights there is fantastic. And what we do with that last morning at leisure is, you know, as photographers, there's always time for Lightroom. But on that second night, or our third night, on our last morning, we do quite a bit of an astrophotography session in the evening. So everyone's kind of up until the early hours of the morning. And so it's quite nice to have a morning at leisure the day before we move on to the next chapter of our journey. An incredible experience. This little calf, it was fantastic last year. This was our second morning. We found this cow and her calf, and the Rhino Trust guys had not seen this calf yet. So this was the very first time that they had seen this little one as well, which is fantastic. And the excitement that they showed when they found this new calf was it was really great to see. Incredible guys who are just so passionate about what they do. And I tell you what, you have to drive this terrain and be out there day after day after day looking for these animals and looking after these animals is a really dedicated cause. And more astrophotography. So as I said, on our last night or any of the evenings, we spend a bit of time photographing the night skies. And in preparation for this, we've got to have a UV torch around, because there are some other creepy crawlies and other desert wildlife of Namibia that come out under the cover of dark. The scorpions, this is the kind of the way that they react underneath the UV light. The exoskeleton glows like this, a bioluminescent type reaction to the UV light. And it is really fantastic to play around with multiple exposures. So you take the first shot of the scorpion underneath the UV light, and you would compose it in a way that you would leave some space for the sky. So this is actually 2 images, because you wouldn't be able to achieve focus on the scorpion as well as the night sky. So essentially, scorpion was photographed first. On the Canon system, you're able to go into your menu, choose the image that you want to shoot your overlay onto. So for example, all of that night sky would have been black in the scorpion image, and then set it up on a tripod, photograph the night sky. The night sky gets exposed against the darker portion of that frame. So maybe a little bit technical, but really good fun to play around with, and you'll be amazed at the kind of results that you are able to get. We did a similar sort of exercise with a welwitschia plant. So the scorpion and the welwitschia were photographed probably 2 to 3 hours before we photographed the night sky. And this night sky was just literally just at the back of camp, outside of the tents. There is no light pollution around. So a fantastic opportunity to get out the camera, set up the tripod, and try both star trails as well as photographing the Milky Way. So the final chapter of this Desert Wildlife of Namibia journey is probably the most exciting one, and that's up to the Hoanib Skeleton Coast Camp. And just flying from Desert Rhino Camp up north, you can see that things change dramatically. It gets even more remote. It gets very, very hard, very dry, a lot of rock, a lot of just edgy, hard environment in which you could never think that animals would thrive, let alone survive. And that landing then at Hoanib Skeleton Coast Camp, and this is the kind of welcoming that you have, is quite special. The tents and the rooms here have been designed obviously with the extreme conditions in mind. There's a very cold breeze that comes through in the morning and a mist that blows in off of the Skeleton Coast up the Hoanib River and into the kind of camp area. But then during the day, you know, temperatures in the early to mid 30s in the winter months and even higher during the summer months. So the camp has really had to be built to support those extremes. And the rooms themselves are absolutely magnificent. Really, really top class. You can see that, you know, compared to the previous camps, this would be considered one of Wilderness Safari's premier camps, much larger rooms, and just a premium service all the way around. A smaller camp as well, I think there's only about 8 tents here. And I just wanted to kind of show and give you a better idea of the area that we explore when we're down here. You can see the Hoanib River running quite clearly through here, and some other tributaries coming through. Runs all the way down towards the Atlantic. There's an oasis in here. The river, when it does flood, kind of very seldom pushes all the way through. It reaches this and just kind of peters out into this oasis. And then Mova Bay is an area that I'm going to touch on. But essentially, on one of the days, we do a full day. We leave nice and early in the morning. We follow all the way down the Hoanib River, up onto the dunes, and then down towards Mova Bay, where we then have a packed lunch on the shore of the Skeleton Coast on the Atlantic Ocean. Freezing cold, strong winds, but an incredible experience. And then the guests fly back. So there's a scenic flight that will take them straight back towards the camp. So that's a full day's outing, just to give you an idea of the scale and the area that we do explore whilst we're here. And this is what the Hoanib region looks like. You can see beautiful trees along the actual riverbed itself. But as soon as you move away from that, a lot of exposed sand and a lot of exposed rock, very desolate. So the beautiful part about that is that there's a lot of animal activity in the riverbed itself. And when we were there last year, I think literally 2 days before we got there, the river was actually flowing to an extent. And when we drove down, we got this kind of cracked mud effect that you get. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that scenes like this were coming out of Mana pools, because it's the same trees. It's the winter thorns that are dropping their pods at the peak of the dry season, providing the much needed sustenance for animals like elephants, like oryx, giraffe, and so many other general game species that concentrate their movements along this riverbed. But I mean, this is in the middle of the desert. It is an extreme environment and a place that I certainly would never have thought looked the way that it does, or supports the wildlife that it does. And very much like the elephants in Mana pools, where they would kind of be reaching up to get the pods, if they haven't fallen yet, or pulling down the branches. There are a couple of big bulls in this area that will do that and kind of bring down those branches to feed on. And then 2 herds, smaller herds that were moving along the river, certainly when we were there, and from what I understood from the researchers that we engaged with, that use this Hoanib River on a regular basis. And these are the sort of scenes that you get with these beautiful mountains in the background, the riverbed in the foreground, and beautiful anna trees lining that. Obviously, a lot of general game comes down into this riverbed as well, things like springbok, oryx, and these 1 or 2 sections along the riverbed where you get the steep curve, and you can see how the riverbed is just literally caved away. It's been carved when the water has flowed through here, and you get these massive embankments. And I was always just hoping to find elephants or lions sitting on top there. I've seen 1 or 2 images of elephants walking across a ridge like that. And you can see why it's just such a photogenic part of Namibia and photogenic destination. And this particular section of the Hoanib is part of Wilderness's private concession. So you don't see a lot of vehicles through here. You don't see any self-drives moving through this area whatsoever. Very, very remote, very wild, and very beautiful. Another example of a panorama that's been photographed here, giraffe underneath the riverbed, underneath the trees in the riverbed, oryx on the top of one of those edges of the river bank. And I used this in a post on Instagram earlier, just talking about the Namibia being a land of contrasts. And this is not a composite or anything like that. This is just the way that sand had been blown up against a rocky mountain side. And again, you know, it speaks to the more artistic traveler who wants to appreciate these things in nature, because often you might just look at this and drive past and not really stop to take a photograph. But this sort of thing fascinates me, and I absolutely love exploring with guests. And we have the time to do that. We spend 4 nights at Hoanib Skeleton Coast Camp, and often we'll head up onto a high point for a sunset. And it really, you know, you'd be forgiven that this was something out of like the Mars rover expedition, because it really is a Martian landscape, but it is incredibly beautiful. So for the day trip, we kind of moved down, and the lovely thing is you get out nice and early if you catch the elephant herds. And we knew that the Ellies had been in the riverbed the afternoon before we headed out. So we dropped straight in, we picked up fresh tracks of them, we tracked them for a little bit, and our guide was great. He knew the area, he knew where they were heading when we did eventually get a glimpse of them. So we cut out and cut around, and we had this beautiful backlight. First thing in the morning, the herd of elephants walking onto us. I think it was a group of about 16 or so. So this is just a small part of them. They were kicking up dust as they went foraging for the grasses along this sandy plain. And they actually had, each of the groups that we were with there had young Ellies that were born just in the week before we got up there. And we met with some elephant researchers who were actually quite concerned about these little ones. If I recall correctly, one of the cows, it was her first calf, and she was quite big, and her calf was quite small, and they were concerned that the calf wouldn't actually be able to reach and latch on. And the distance that these elephants move, and now you can imagine these newborn calves having to keep up and move along with the herds. They were really quite concerned, but I do think that 2 of the little ones that were born around the time that we were there did make it through. We did also see quite an interesting and very emotional scene where one of the calves from another group didn't survive, and it actually died very close to a waterhole, an artificial waterhole, and we actually watched some interaction with the elephants there. It was really interesting to see, and quite emotional, really. But really great spending time with these desert-adapted elephants as they went about foraging in the early morning. And then as we got closer to the Atlantic coastline, you start to get more of these dune systems. And again, we stopped and just got off and appreciated the smaller things. And I absolutely loved the way this little creeper had kind of gone across the sand dune here. And, you know, without explaining it, you might think that these are massive trees. I just love the play of the light and the shadows. And again, being able to get off the vehicle, walk around, explore, you start to see so much more when you are able to do that. Things like patterns and textures, again, very similar to the hard rock and the soft sand image that I showed you a little earlier. And then driving right up onto the top of the dunes. So the vehicles here, the guys have inbuilt little pumps to adjust the tire pressure. So when we headed up onto the dunes, you just drop the tire pressures down quite a lot to give you a little bit more traction, and straight up to the top. And so you're standing on top of this dune. The wind is blowing off of the Skeleton Coast, off of the Atlantic Ocean. There's a bit of a fog in the air, which is starting to lift. And you can see, I mean, you're in the middle of the desert and you're all wrapped up with beanies and gloves and whatever else have you. But a really great experience to have coffee on top of a sand dune in the middle of the morning. And then as you get closer to the actual coastline itself, it gets a bit more rocky again, and a lot of jackals. Now, the Skeleton Coast was called that because of not only just the shipwrecks that would happen on there, or that would get washed up on shore because of the weather conditions, but a lot of carcasses of whales. There's a seal colony there, and so there's a lot of skulls and bones and things running around. So a lot of jackal and good potential for brown hyena in this area as well. And this is, once you get to the coastline, you're able to, again, hop off and explore. This is an old shipwreck, one of many along this coastal region. And the wrecks from these ships, obviously just with the ships being smashed into the rocks, the guys losing their sense of direction with the fog in the area. And a lot of these ships have just been smashed and washed up onto the shore. A fascinating piece of history here as we go into the Mova Bay, which is the kind of an admin area for the Skeleton Coast National Park, from what I understand, is they've got a museum here which showcases a whole bunch of skeletons that they found. So they've picked up all sorts of bones and skulls and details, but they've also got a lot of history. So they talk about some of the planes that would have crashed in the area, some of the boats that have washed up and the ships that have washed up as well. So quite a nice little museum to take a walk around. And then from there, we head along down towards a seal colony, a massive seal colony. And again, there's always jackals hanging around the fringes of this colony. So it's weird. You've gone from, you know, the interior, driven past a herd of elephants, things like giraffe and oryx, and you come all the way down to the coastline, and now you've got seals. And this is all in one morning. And then we stop on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean for a lunch, which has actually been laid out there. These guys have a partnership with a crew at the Mova Bay area, so you don't take any of this with you. They prepare the food, they set up the table, all the plates and everything are there. Everything's packed down with stones so that it doesn't blow away, because the wind is blowing an absolute gale. I know it looks like a calm and peaceful day, but believe me, it is far from it. And then the day kind of ends with the guests flying back to the camp, as I said. And that's the first 2 days, essentially. And from there, we start to explore a little further afield, because one of the other key focuses of this area, and one of the highlights, is the desert adapted lions. So anyone who's seen the Vanishing Kings documentaries will be familiar with it, and have seen the book. You'll be familiar with Philip Stunder's work on the desert lions of Namibia. An incredible guy, an incredible region. And so that was a key focus for us. We really wanted to try and get these lions and to try and see lions in this environment and photograph them in this environment. So we spent quite a bit of time heading out a little further afield, tracking them. And we went through some beautiful terrain. It really, you know, wherever you look, the stage is set with a beautiful scene. You just need something to anchor that shot, whether it's a giraffe or a flock of ostrich, an oryx, or another ostrich. And then eventually one afternoon, we'd had reports that the guys had heard that lions were in this area. They'd seen the tracks. So we went in, we left camp just after lunch. We left a bit earlier. We went up, and lo and behold, we come around one of the corners. We come into some deep bush and pop out, and there is this oryx just lying out in the open. And just off to the side, we got a little bit of glimpse of movement. And in this little bush here, you can see these two, or you can see one of them at the moment, but lion. And I tell you, I could still remember the feeling of excitement that we had. And we just parked that vehicle there and sat. And I said to the guys, right, this is us. We've got to wait. You could see that they were wild. They looked at us. You can just even see in this posture, they were unsure. They kind of came off onto the edge of the bush every now and again just to have a look at us, but then reclined and kind of went back into the thicket. And I said, as soon as the sun goes down, these guys are going to start to get a little bit more comfortable. Hopefully they'll come out and start to feed before then. We were looking around. We knew that there must have been adult females around here. These young lions were just too young to be off on their own. And we literally spent the entire afternoon out here just waiting to see what would unfold and just being patient. And eventually we did get very lucky. We saw the cubs come out. They started to play around and feed. And as the sun went down, we looked behind us. We could see that the cubs were starting to stare. And they were always looking in this direction. And I scanned with binoculars, and first of all, got one lioness poking her head out. She'd obviously been hiding in these thickets here. And as soon as it was almost like they traced the shadow, as the sun was setting, the shadow obviously progressed. And when these lionesses felt a little bit more comfortable, as the sun started to set, they then popped out and gave us an incredible show. They walked out across this open plain, coming back towards our vehicle now, and then to where the carcass is. And you can see that the light had changed considerably by this time. The sun was just starting to go down. But there was interaction between the two females, both of which are collared from a research purpose. Big threat out here is lions going for livestock. The communities are not that far away. things like donkeys and cattle are easy prey items. And if you lived in a desert environment and you had the option of hunting giraffe, which is a key focus for the lions in this area, or taking down a cow or a donkey, I think the choice is it's very simple. So that is one of the big threats for these cats in this area, is that they stray too close to the communities on the fringes and then get too comfortable killing livestock and end up being killed by the community members themselves. And yeah, so there's some great work being done where these guys are using an early warning system, and it's linked to geofencing. So the people in the villages would get a message to say that the lions are nearby, because the collar has entered into an area and sent off a signal to let people know that they're there. So you can kind of put a fence or a boundary around there so that people would get a notification when these animals are close, and they can then protect their livestock a little bit better. But this was an afternoon that I would never forget. I mean, the collar or no collar, we'd found these wild lions, and you could just see the way that they looked at you, the way that you had to behave around them was different. This was not a sabi pull up next to the lions and they kind of sleep and don't even blink. This was a sighting that you had to work for. You had to earn your stripes, and you had to play it very cautiously so as not to disturb them. And I absolutely loved it. It was by far one of the highlights for me and for our guests, I think. It couldn't have been any better. And again, yeah, so apart from those lions, we spent a lot of time with the elephants. This is one of the watering holes in the Hoanib area. Again, another bull elephant stretching for those anapods. And I think that those kind of scenes sum it up for me, you know, these lions in the rocks, elephants in this big riverbed with these beautiful trees. And then I think this was our very last morning as well, just soft light. You can see that riverbank, exposed riverbank in the background, and the dark rock. The pastel tones of the light in this area in the early morning is just spectacular. And I think also just being able to explore and just feel alone and at peace, and just you kind of get a different sense of appreciation of just how small you are in the world. This is one of our guests, Eric. I don't know if you can see him just parked off on a rock out there, but it really is incredible, and the kind of distances that you cover, and you think there's just so much more to see and explore in this part of the world, and you think about the distances that these animals are moving. So I've chosen to kind of end the presentation with what is without a doubt one of my favorite images from this trip. And you know, it's a pano of these elephants walking through the Hoanib riverbed with those two calves that I mentioned earlier. And you've got everything from the anna trees or the winterthorn trees to the exposed riverbank up at the top there, the soft sands, and then the exposed hard rock up at the top. And it really was just a mind-blowing trip. So something very different. It's not Etosha, it's not Sossusvlei, Flay, but it is some of the most wild and remote parts of Namibia that you can ever imagine. And an incredible experience. So I'm going to kind of stop sharing my screen now as soon as I can get my mouse cursor to get me to there, and make myself big on your screen, and want to see if there is anything going on in the Q&A section. No questions. Either I've done a very poor job of inspiring you guys, or I've done a very good job of covering all of the information. I'm just going to scroll through the chat then. So if there are any questions that you guys would like to have, please go drop them into that Q&A section. I'd be more than happy to answer them. Namibia, Kim, hey Kim, so great to see you. Kim says that Namibia is one of her favorite places. The contrasts of the landscape are incredible, they are. Nicholas, one more destination to go. What a dream for new sightings. My friend, it's the polar opposite of the Congo, but just as interesting and just as mind-blowing. Silke, fantastic that you've been able to join us. What a stunning landscape. Lovely, very artistic. Thank you so much, Silke. I appreciate that. Ed, great to have you join us. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. Julie, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. So Nicholas is just asking in the Q&A section the types of lenses. All of them. No, to be fair, I would think the 70 to 200 is probably your staple here. And I say that because from a landscape perspective, shooting portraits and then stitching them together to have those panoramas, the 70-200 is fantastic for that. And it kind of makes up for the 72 or the 2470 in that regard. So I would rather shoot a pano with the 70-200 than shoot completely wide with something like a 2470. The other ideal lens for this environment, I would say, would be something like the 200-400 with the built-in 1.4 converter that Canon has. That is a fantastic lens because you do need a little bit of focal length, and you could shoot an oryx on a ridge here at 600 mils and still have a lot of the environment around. So having that flexibility of something like the 80-400 on the Nikon, 100-400 on the Canon, or 200-400 with a built-in converter would be fantastic. That I would say is probably the great selection of lenses for this. James, how long are the transfers between lodges? So the flight from Windhoek up to Doro Nawas is about an hour-and-a-half flight. We change the itinerary to do a drive across to Damaraland, but then the flights in between the camps are anything from 30-45 minutes to an hour and a bit. The longest flight is to get up into Hoanib Skeleton Coast Camp from Desert Rhino Camp. And often, depending on the routing, you may actually have to come back to Doro Nawas because that acts as the central hub for connections. So you can imagine if someone is coming from Damaraland camp and going to Hoanib and Desert Rhino camp going to Hoanib, it makes more sense to get everyone back to Doro Nawas and then fly up together. So there's quite a bit of flying in between. And again, as photographers with additional weight restrictions, our package, we include an additional freight seat so that we've got all of the additional weight takes you up to about 35 kilograms. Martha Myers, when will I be returning? Martha, I was due to return last month, but something came up. Jokes aside, we have rescheduled for next year. I think the trip runs in May next year, which I'm really excited to get back up there. Johan Ensland, for me, it's easier to do a self-drive. As you live in northern Namibia, how do you suggest to get to these lodges? Is it possible by road? So Johan, I know that you can get to Desert Rhino Camp. I think you park on the eastern edge. There's a gate, there's an entrance into the Palenbach concession. And I think you have to leave your vehicle there and the guys would then collect you. And if that is on your doorstep and it's close by, I can highly recommend it. It is absolutely mind-blowing. So I would certainly do that. I think to get to Hoanib Skeleton Coast Camp, I don't know if they allow self-drives through, but I do know that you can kind of go down the riverbed if you have permission or if you are visiting one of the two lodges that are in that area there. So you can actually drive down through the Hoanib with permission. Lindsay, do you fly through Joburg to get to Namibia from outside of Africa? Yes. So almost all of the flights would then come through into Johannesburg and connect from Johannesburg to Windhoek, or potentially from Cape Town to Windhoek as well. It's going to be interesting to see which airlines are going to be flying that route. It is quite a busy route and a popular route. There's a lot of movement between Namibia and South Africa, both for business and for leisure. So there are regular flights. There were three airlines doing daily flights out of Windhoek pre-COVID-19. So guys, if there's no other questions, oh, Rebecca Yeoman, great to see you include Desert Rhino Camp. Sorry, Will, where is it now? I saw it here. Rebecca, great to see you include Desert Rhino. Many itineraries seem to miss out on that unique experience. That's exactly it, Rebecca. I did want this itinerary to be slightly different, and I did, as with all of our wild itineraries, you know, it's not just about the photographs, it's about the experience as well. And I can tell you, you know, tracking black rhino on foot is a memory that is just, it'll always stay with me. And funny enough, on the first time that John and I went, we got a charge from a black rhino, and I watched most of that charge through the 200-400 up until it was about 10 meters away from us and turned in a pile of dust and stones. But I tell you what, it really is special to see those animals in the wild, number one, but to do it on foot is just something even better. Thank you so much for the compliments on the images. Dhruti and Mandeep, really appreciate it. Maria, thank you for joining us. I'm glad you enjoyed it as well. Guys, I think I'm going to leave it there. There should be an automated mail that will come through to you, thanking you for joining me this evening. There is going to be a link on there. You should have my email address, but if you don't, it's andrew@wild-eye.co.za. Please, if you have any questions, would like more information on this or any of our other itineraries, please do let me know. My next webinar is going to be focusing on, I'm going back into the camera and the technical side of things now. I'm going to be looking at autofocus systems. So I'm going to be unpacking the autofocus system of digital cameras, everything from the DSLRs also all the way through to the mirrorless setups. Things like back button focus, AF points, AF areas, AF modes. So if you are more technologically inclined and would like to get a better understanding of your camera's autofocus system, then do keep an eye out for that. I'm going to be sharing some quite cool tech where I'm going to take you inside of my viewfinder to kind of show examples of how and where to move AF points and AF areas within the frame. But for now, I'm going to head off, and thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And we, as a company, again, just while I really appreciate all of the support that you guys have shown for us during this time by supporting these webinars, engaging with us. And as always, any constructive criticism and ideas and suggestions for new webinar topics that you would like to see covered, please do drop us a line, let us know. We're always open to hearing from you guys. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to hosting you on our next webinar or in the field when we're allowed to travel again. Cheers.